Y'all can hear me now. We have restarted the Bible study. I saw on it that somebody said they're not hearing any sound. So let me know if you can hear sound at this time, um, so that we can make sure that we're not um, wasting our time. Okay, good evening and welcome to tonight's Bible study. I am hoping that y'all can hear. I saw a message that said that y'all could not hear. Um, we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Um, I'll go ahead and read the first 8 verses, and we will go ahead and do it from that. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There is a time for everything, a season for everything under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. I mentioned before I noticed that y'all weren't hearing that the reality is one of the reasons I started this Bible study in Ecclesiastes was because of this chapter. And Solomon, the wisest man, said there is a time for everything. That's how the verse is. There is a time for everything. Um, and that time is the most valuable thing that we possess. And for 26 years, I worked in the federal prison, and what the inmates always said was they were doing time. If they got 5 years, they counted it in months. They did 60 months. If they had 10 years, they did 120 months. And a lot of them just literally were doing time. They wasted their time in prison. They did not improve themselves or did not use the education or the chapel or anything else to improve themselves. And some of them did. Some of them learned how to work and get trade, etc. But the majority of them just wasted the time. And unfortunately, as a chaplain, the fact that I was there for 26 years, I saw some of them leave. They went out and they came back because they used their time while in prison selfishly, most unwisely. Unfortunately, it's not just inmates. There are a lot of people who are just wasting time. We are all given the same amount of time each and every day. A day is 24 hours. And yet at the same time, it doesn't matter who you are, male, female, black, white, Hispanic, rich, poor. We're all given the same amount of time. But the problem is not the time, it's how we use it. For example, in a day, there's 1,440 minutes or 86,400 seconds. But each and every day, we are given that time, but we can't save it up like we do money. We can't, add more time to a day or take away time from a day, or, you know, each and every day it's like we're given this bank account of time, and how we use it and invest it is important. um, I know, growing up the way I did, I was not very disciplined, and then I married Rosalie, who is very disciplined, and she accomplished a lot more than I did in a day. And she taught my kids how to be very disciplined, and I know I've done a study here about discipline, how important it is. The thing is, it's not that uh, some people just accomplish more with the time. And Solomon makes it quite clear that there is a time for everything. Every day, we have a time that we set aside for sleeping, a time that we set aside for working, and a time for recreation or play. You know, no one is more important. And I want for y'all to hear that. Sleep is very important. Work is very important. Recreation is very important. Solomon's idea here is there is a time for everything. and that there is a season for everything under the heaven. And I want for us to understand that there is indeed time for everything. Unfortunately, a lot of us just waste the time. Like I said, I knew a lot of inmates who simply wasted the time that they had rather than use the time. And then there were some inmates who said, now that I have all this time and I'm not busy, distracted with work and all the other distraction in life, I can focus and do what I want. Unfortunately, even though we are out here, a lot of us don't use our time wisely. And Solomon said, there's a time for everything under the heaven. There's a season. And we in Minnesota understand season only too well. Right now it's winter. It's a time for ice fishing and skating on the ice and snowmobiling. In a few more months, as yesterday was Groundhog Day, we have 6 more weeks of winter. Here in Minnesota, probably 8 or 10, really. There'll be a time in the next 6 months when the ice will melt and be gone, and we will be doing things on the lake with boats and, skiing and boat riding and stuff. The point is, season and time, we can't control that. But how we control each and every day and our personal time, the discipline and the choices we make is important. And Solomon points out there's a time for everything, and he starts with the very basic thing. There's a time for birth, a time to be born, and a time to die. As human beings, we all have a birthday, the day we were born, and because we're mortals, one day we will die. And so Solomon starts with that, says, as human beings, there's a time for birth and there's a time for death. There's a time to be born and a time to die. And none of us can change that. As a matter of fact, we don't determine when we were born and we don't determine when we'll die. God is in control of that. But he goes on and points out there's a time to plant, there's a time to uproot. We know that planting is always in the spring and harvesting and pulling the stuff, is in the fall for harvest time. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. He goes on and talks on and on of these opposites, on both extremes. There's a time to tear down and a time to build up. And, quite often we always want to say, oh, there's only time for this. And especially as Christian, we want to emphasize only love and forgiveness and grace. But what I need to point out to you is the other side of that is also hate and, holding people accountable, etc. And that's what Solomon is pointing out, is there's a time for everything under the heavens. As he points out, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. And how silly would it be if you were at a funeral and everybody else is weeping and you're there laughing? There's a time for weeping and there's a time for laughing. There's a time, I know when I'm at home and I'm doing goofy things with my wife and kids, there's a time for laughter. Or when we're at church and enjoying ourselves, there's a time for laughter. But there's also a time for weeping. And sometimes weeping and laughter happens at the same time. Because as we will see, Solomon said, there's a time to mourn and there's a time to dance. We have to realize that these things at certain times it's appropriate. At certain other times, the opposite is appropriate. And to be naive and say, oh, we should always be dancing and we should always love and we should always... No, there's a time for everything. There's a time when we gather stones and there's a time when we scatter them. When we're in the building phase, we gather stuff. When there's a time of war and stuff, there's a time we scatter the stones. Solomon is pointing out this thing. He said there's a time to search and there's a time to give up. And too many of us think, it's all search, accumulate. But there's a time to give and give up. And he goes on and said there's a time to tear and there's a time to mend. And he goes on and make a very good advice. There's a time to be silent and there's a time to speak. And I when I first read that, there is a time that we should just shut up and listen, to be silent and listen. As a matter of fact, one of the biggest problems we have, and I say we because I have this problem too, my profession is a talking profession, talking, teaching, but my profession is also a listening professional. So, both things are in this profession. And unfortunately, right now, because of this Bible study, it's one way where I'm just talking. I wish it was the Bible study like we normally have, where I could also hear the feedback and listen to y'all's input. Because, there's a time for both, a time to listen and a time to speak. And in conversation, that's what it is. It's a talk, listen, talk, listen. Unfortunately, too many people think it's just talk, 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 talk. And that's not what it is. There's a time for everything under the sun. Verse 8 said, there's a time to love and there's a time to hate. And as Christians, we want to emphasize love alone and not hate. But in reality, God points out that we should use love and hate in the same sentence sometimes. And I've talked about this before, that we should use love and hate. For example, God said, I love you, but I hate your sin. And we should say the same thing to our kids and people we love. I love you. As Christians, we love people, but we hate their sin. And talking to my kids, whenever they did something wrong, I said, I will always love you. But whenever you do something wrong, I hate the wrong that you did. And I need to correct you. And as parents, that's part of life. We call it sometimes tough love. Tough love is really hating the wrong that somebody does. And that's what God says. I love you, but because of tough love, I hate the sin. And so as parents, just like God loves us and hates our sin, we should love our kids and we should love one another, but we should hate evil and the wrong things in this world. So Solomon, a wise man, said, don't be naive, and it's just emphasize love, 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 love. Because if you're naive, people will run over you. And I know what I'm speaking about, being run over. I remember some brand new inmate would come in, and because I was the chaplain, he would, inevitably, they'd come in and they said, Chaplain, I need X, Y, and Z. And just because I was the chaplain, they expected me to do it. Well, if you're a Christian, you are expected to do this. And I would stop and say, hey, wait a minute. Let me talk to you some more, because I'm not a doormat and I'm here to help you, but I'm not here to enable you. There is a time as a chaplain, as a pastor, that I help. And there's a time that I say, whoa, you're taking advantage. And this is not helping you. You're manipulating people and trying to get something and beat the system. And so the point is, there is a time for everything. And appropriate response at appropriate time is what we need to understand. And that's what Solomon is talking about. There's a time to be born and there's a time to die. There's a time to mourn, there's a time to dance. There's a time for war, and there's a time for peace. As Christians, we think peace, 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 peace. But there is a time for war. For example, in World War II, Hitler was not going to stop unless he took over the world. There was a time for war. And so we need to understand that we can't be naive. There's a time for both. And that's what Solomon is talking about. There's everything. There's a time for everything. The question is, how do we use our time, since it is the most valuable thing that we possess? He goes on and points out, picking up at verse 9, what do a worker, an individual, gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. I want for us to understand, none of us as human beings can truly fathom, understand all that God has done. And God placed upon us this burden as human being. And, when it comes to God, Solomon makes it quite clear. He has made everything beautiful. God is perfect, and everything that God does is perfect. But as human beings, we are not. And God has made everything beautiful in its time. There is a time that we are born, and that's wonderful. And there's a time we die, and that also is wonderful. He has set eternity in our hearts. Without death, life would be meaningless. Without pain, being pain-free would be meaningless. We need both extreme. Without poverty, we would not, if everybody was the same, it's the differences that makes us unique and special. God has set everything in eternity and has made everything beautiful in its time. No one can fathom. As individuals, we don't understand God's plan, but God has burdened us with this. He goes on, it says, I know there is nothing better for people to do than to be happy and to do good while they live. And Solomon's point is one that we need to understand. As Christians, we are to be happy and we are to do what? Good. A few months ago when we were doing the Proverbs, I said we should do good all the time. Do good all the time. But sometimes doing good is telling somebody no. That, for example, if a person is a drug addict and they want money to do drugs, our answer should be what? No, giving them money is not doing them any good. We should do good all the time. And Solomon is saying there's nothing better than to be happy and to do good with the time we have. But depending upon the circumstance, the good that we do need to fit the circumstance. And that's something that each and every one of us have to be, as the Bible says, wise as serpent and innocent as dove. Verse 13 said that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. This is a gift from God. So one of the things that I learned in prison, as I started out this lesson, inmates are doing time. And there was a group of inmates that were hardworking. And what they said is that it passed their time better and it made them have reason and purpose. That having a work job to go to gave them reason and purpose. And here they were in prison. They had the choice to work or not to work. If they didn't work, it cost them a little bit of money. If they did work, they didn't get paid a whole lot. As a matter of fact, it was 65 cents an hour. The top pay was $2 an hour. And yet some of them worked extremely hard. And they said, here's the thing, chaplain. If it wasn't for work and getting tired and doing things and keeping myself busy, time, just wasting time would be harder, and doing time would be harder. And so as I reread this verse, it said that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil, in their work. And I talked about this last week, that we should work for satisfaction. We should enjoy what we're doing. And that I worked with people at the prison who hated their jobs. And my advice to them is, if you really hate your job and you're doing it just for money, quit. And my advice to Christians, to anybody, if we're doing it just for the money, quit. You should find joy and satisfaction in your life, because basically, if you spend 8 hours a day, you have 24. That's a third of your life you're giving for money alone and not for satisfaction. You really should make sure that, as Solomon said, this is a gift from God. The time you have and how you spend it, and work. A third of our life is sleeping. A third of it is working. Do we want to waste a third of our life in something we hate? And my response is no. He goes on in verse 14. He says, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does this so that people will fear him. So he again reinforced that idea that God is perfect and everything he does is perfect, and that everything he does will endure forever. He does this so that we as human beings will fear him. We will come to realize he is God and we are not. And that there's a time for that. And one of the things I found that is important in this whole discussion is people always make time for the important things. And let me explain what I mean. There was a lady that gave some excuse once that she couldn't come to church because she had this X, Y, and Z problem. And because she couldn't sit in the pew and she couldn't do this and she couldn't do that. And then one day she was called to go to court because her daughter was getting a divorce and they were fighting a custody battle for her grandkid. And sure enough, there she was in a hard bench for not an hour for church, but like 6 and 7 hours at a time for days while they went through this court hearing the proceeding. And here's the thing. I asked her, well, how come you can endure 6 hours, 7 hours at the courthouse, but you can't endure 1 hour at church? What's the difference? And her point was, this is important. And I go, yeah, and church is important. There is a time for everything. And Sunday, we as Christians dedicate a time for church. And that is important. There is a time for work, and when you go to work, you do your work. And there's a time. And, Sunday only comes around once a week. And so my point to this person was, your excuse is not valid if it is important for you to go to the courthouse and you can't use your medical excuse that you gave me. Obviously, it's not the time, it's your choice. And so obviously that lady quit coming to church completely and quit giving me excuses because I didn't buy it. And the same is true for all of us. We make time for what is important in our lives. We make time for what is important. We're all given the same 24 hours. We're all given the same 1,440 minutes. The question is, how do we spend it? For me, I made the decision to do work that I love to do. I made the decision to spend an hour a day reading or more. I made the decision, to read the Bible. The question is not the amount of time we have, it's how we choose to spend it. Let's switch now to the last few verses for, I'm trying to make sure we get the full 30 minutes, even though we lost some time. It says, Solomon points out, whatever is has already been, and what will be has been done before, and God will call the past to account. And I saw that nothing else is under the sun. Folks, there's nothing new. Solomon pointed this out before, that whatever has been done before it's there. And whatever will be has been done before. It's just reality. He goes on and said, I saw that there's nothing else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked. For there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. And Solomon is being prophetic here in the sense that one day God will call all of us to judgment. We as Christians know this. One day God will call all of us to judge. There's an appointed time at the end of time where God will judge us. And we see that Solomon points that out very clearly, that our time here on earth, every deed, everything that we do will be called into account by God. He said, but he continues with this idea even further than that and calls into question, how are we different than other animals? Verse 18, he said, I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. God tests us as human beings. Temptation, it's a test. That's what a temptation is. It's a test. God tempts us, tests us, or allow us to be tested so that we can understand. We are just like the animals. Sometimes we are driven by instinct, by lust, by all these things. Surely the fate of human beings, he continues in verse 19, is like that of the animal. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All of them have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. And you have to remember, we talked about this last year in the winter time when we did the study in Genesis, where we pointed out that all of us were created by God, and we are all made out of the same stuff that animals are made out of. God created everything. The difference between human beings and animals, Solomon is fixing to point out here. It says, who knows if the human spirit rises upward and the spirit of the animal goes down to the earth? The reality is, the thing that makes us unique and different than the animals is the Spirit of God that indwells us. That's the only thing that's different. Um, and but animals and us share the same thing. As a matter of fact, modern science has pointed out that there's very little difference between us and another animal. We're made out of the same thing: carbon and trace elements, and we breathe in and out oxygen. And I live in the house with my dog, and what she breathes out, it floats around, and I breathe in, and that's what Solomon is saying. We all are the same. As a matter of fact, if you really want to prove that we're all the same, if you take a human body, put it in a very hot fire, called cremation, you take out the stuff that's left, the cremates remain, put it in a little jar, and I had 2 of my dogs cremated. You look at the stuff for the cremation from the dog and look at the stuff for the cremation for the human being, and you can't tell the difference. It's the same substance. Chemistry would tell you, it's carbon and this and that. Reality is, Solomon is saying, we are created beings like all other created beings, and there's only one God. And so we are no different than them in that respect. They are created, we are created. We are mortals, they are mortal. We will all die. But the question is, who knows if this human spirit will go up and the animal spirit will go down? The only person that knows is God. But as Christians, we do have a choice in that. We either accept God and his ways or we don't. He goes on and say, verse 20, so I saw there is nothing better for a person to do than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what has happened, will happen, or will happen after them? Solomon points out that there is a time for everything, and during our lifetime, I don't know how long we will live. Some people never make it to birth. They die before they are born. Some people make it to 100, and some of us anywhere in between. And it doesn't matter how long or how short our life is. The question is, how do we live our lives daily? And I mentioned when I first started this, each and every day we're given 24 hours. We can't save it for next week or next month. The only time that we live in is in the here and now. Too many people live in the good old days. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when they were younger. Even the church does that. Back in the 60s when the churches were full and, people went to church. Today, we don't have that. Well, folks, we are living in these times. And the time that in the past we can't do anything about. The only time we have is now. And the question is, what are we going to do with our time? My suggestion to y'all is, A, do work that you enjoy. B, participate in the church life. Get in a great relationship with God. There's a time for everything. Just like there's a time right now for us to do this Bible study. There's a time for confirmation. There's a time for church on Sunday. There's a time for sleep. There's a time for work. We are living in this time. Is it perfect? No. As a matter of fact, nostalgia, 20 years ago, it wasn't perfect either. So my view is, quit complaining. God has given us so many years, so much time, and what we do now will affect now and the future. We can't go back in time and change the past, but we can do something about now, and what we do now will affect the future. So my advice is, there's a time for everything. Make sure you use your time wisely. Next week, we'll pick up on chapter 4. And thank y'all for listening in, and I'll go ahead and get ready for confirmation.